Hi sewing friends, welcome back. Today I'm going to be taking you through the process of one of my patterns, the big wrap dress pattern. I'm going to be using this fabric from Cali Fabrics. It's an online boutique, but they also have a brick and mortar. I've never been to the brick and mortar, I've only ever shopped online. If I can find this beautiful rayon challis, I will link it down below. If not, I'll see if I can find something similar. The pattern will also be linked down below. I am super excited about this project. I have been dying to get going on this all week. So without further ado, let's jump in and cut out our fabric. This pattern has 3 different views, A, B, and C. Today we are going to be making view B. This view requires the least amount of notions. All you'll need to get started is your fashion fabric, some scissors, thread, pins or clips, interfacing that matches the weight of your fabric. The very first step we're going to do is actually stay stitch our neckline. So I'm going to do a running stitch with a very long stitch on my machine from the top down to the bottom, all along the neckline at the front. You're going to start with your darts. I've marked mine here on the fabric already. So I'm going to pin them in place and then I'll take them over to the machine, and I like to start at the point of my dart and I'll set the needle here and then I will work my way towards the outside. One additional thing I like to do is after I've knotted them, take my loose threads here. And I like to thread it onto my needle and then through my dart. And I just do this for the top one because it keeps you from having the loose threads up at the top. And then I will clip these as close to the fabric as possible. I feel like it gives your dart just a slightly cleaner look. So now that I've done, I'll do this one. And then I will go take this to the machine and press it. I'll press the side dart down and the center front dart towards the center front. Both sides are pressed and darts are in. We're now going to move on to connecting our back and our front shoulder seams. Match the notches at the shoulders on both sides. I'll pin and then I'll sew at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Side seams are next step on the bodice. So we'll do right sides together. I'll pin these, matching our notches and your tops and bottoms, and then also at a 5/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. Waistbands are next. This is the front and this is the back. You should have one back waistband and 2 fronts. You should have marked on your fabric these little dots here. On the right side, we are going to leave these dots open, and on the left side, we're going to close the waistband entirely. I'm going to match the notches and pin in place. Then I'll take it to the machine and sew 5/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. Be sure to leave between the 2 dots open on the right side. The waistband has been constructed. One of the recommendations I have in the pattern instructions is to create a little box around the opening. This will help reinforce it so that as you're pulling it through, it doesn't pull the seam allowance through, and it also will just help it last a little longer. You're not fatiguing the fabric and the stitches quite as much because you've got that thread there. I did mine as a little, because I'm doing French seams, I did mine on the inside, and it's invisible. It'll still help it stay inside, but it's not going to reinforce it the way an outside stitch would. We are now going to attach the waistband to the upper bodice, and we're going to do that like we did all of the others with right sides together. We're going to pin in the round. When you get to your side seams, you're going to want to make sure that they are matched up at the seam, and then we'll sew it at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that our bodice is constructed, we can move on to the skirt. We have 4 pieces to our skirt. We have the front panels, the back panels on the lower portion of the skirt, and then we have 2 upper portions of the skirt. We are going to start with the lower front skirt. You're going to start by folding this over 1/4 of an inch once and then 1/4 of an inch again, so a 1/2 inch total, and we will top stitch that in place. To make it easy on myself, I'm actually going to create a long running stitch at 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and that will help me press it over, and then I'll be able to turn it over again, and I'll be able to pin it in place and top stitch it from there. Here you can see what I was referring to. I created a long running stitch all along the length that I wanted to hem. And then I used that running stitch as a guide, and I folded it over and I pressed it in place. Now I'm going to fold it over once more. And I'm going to pin it in place. From here, I'm going to top stitch it with a regular stitch, not a long running stitch. And I'll do that on both of the lower front skirts. The front edge hem has been completed. I pressed it in the end. It helps set the stitches and it gives it a nice clean look. Now that we have done that, we can take our upper front skirt pieces and we're going to attach them all along the front edge, or the top edge. So you'll start at the edge here and you're going to go all the way around, and this here is going to meet up right there at the very top. And then you'll sew it at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. This should match 1 to 1. There's no need to stretch it into place. But this is what it looks like once you have your piece pinned. I'll add a few more pins and then I will take it over to my machine and sew the seam allowance at 5/8 inch. Back skirt is next up. We've got our upper back and our lower back. What we're going to do first is take our lower back pieces, and this is the center back, and along the center back on the lower back skirt, there is, oops, I think I left the pin in. So this is our center back, and we have a seam down our center back skirt. So we'll do it like we did every other piece, right sides together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once your center back seam is sewn on your lower front skirt, you can take your upper front skirt. You're going to want to mark the center of the bottom of this piece. You're going to match that pin, match the center back and the notches here and here, and the edges. And then you'll just pin in place and sew at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once the back skirt and the front skirts are constructed, the next step would be pockets. I'm not going to be putting pockets in this one because they're optional with this pattern. You don't need to put the pockets in. This fabric is so lightweight, I'm concerned that the pocket's not actually going to be functional. If I put anything in it, I think it'll just drag the dress down. So we're going to forego pockets due to the fabric, and we will just sew up the side seams. So once again, we're going to have right sides together, match our notches, and match your seam for your upper and your lower on the front and the back on both sides. And so as you did with your previous
seam allowance of 5/8 inch. Now that we have our skirt fronts and backs connected at the side seam, we can attach the bodice to the skirt. You're going to begin by matching your side seams and of course your notches. From here, as you move towards the front, you'll want to match your notches at the center front. And then you'll notice that there is a bit of an overhang from the skirt to the bodice. The bodice is cut just slightly bigger because your facing is going to go down here as well and turn over in the end. So you should have a seam allowance worth of overhang. So I'm going to take this over to the machine and I will sew it up at 5/8 inch seam allowance all along that edge.
Here's our progress report. We're now going to move on to the sleeves. I'm going to be doing the short sleeve version with no cuff and no piping. So let's get into that.
Here is our sleeve piece. We are going to begin by creating 2 rows of running stitches. One will be set 1/4 of an inch away from the edge and the second will be 1/2 an inch away from the edge. We create these running stitch lines in order to help us gather and ease the sleeve into the armhole so we can get a much cleaner look. And you'll provide a little bit of a sleeve cap, which will allow for more movement. The running stitches will be created between these 2 dots. You'll find these dots on your pattern. Just mark them onto your fabric and take it over to your machine. Set your machine to the longest stitch length that you have and create the rows. Once your basting stitches are in your sleeve head, you're going to take the long threads that you've left behind. You're just gonna pull them gently, very gently. It doesn't need to be a lot of pull. And you're going to create a little bit of ruching up at the top of the sleeve head. And you do that on both sides so it's done evenly. Just get it central up at the top. After that, you're going to take your sleeve along the side and you're going to do the sleeve seam. This will be right sides together, 5/8 inch seam allowance, like all of the other seams that we have done. When you're finished, your sleeve will look somewhat like this. And it's ready to get placed into your garment. Be attentive when you're placing it that there is a front and a back. The back of the sleeve has the 2 triangular notches in it, which will make a larger notch on my fabric. And the front has the 1 single notch in it. So you'll take your garment and you're going to take the sleeve at the underarm. So the sleeve seam and the underarm seam will match. Just make sure that they're aligned and pin it in place. I then like to take my sleeve and match the notches. From here, I adjust the fullness. There is a notch at the very top, which should match your shoulder seam. And I just place that there to make sure that we are getting an even distribution of the curvature. And from here, you just adjust the fullness until it sits 1 to 1. With all of those notches matching in the proper place. Very little actual gathers are needed. It's just enough to give it the shape at the top so that the piece will fit into the curved area. And once it's 1 to 1, just take it over to your machine and sew at 5/8 inch seam allowance all around the circle.
I've tried on the dress to check the sleeve length before proceeding to hemming the sleeves. I have folded and pressed over the sleeve edge by 1/4 of an inch. I'm now going to fold it up again by 3/4 of an inch. Then I'll pin in place and I'll take it over to my machine and sew it with a straight stitch.
Next up is the waist tie. You'll begin by folding it in half lengthwise, matching the notches on the long end. And for each short end, you're going to leave the short end with the notches in the fabric open. So you'll want to pin the opposite end. You'll pin all along these two edges. When you're finished, this is what you'll have. I added a second row of stitching to my waistband because this is a high tension point, and I wanted to make sure that it had a little bit of extra reinforcement with that extra row of stitching. So as you're pulling on it and tying it, and it's just a lot of friction for the fabric, any little reinforcement you can give it is good. Next up, you're going to want to clip your corner so you get a nice clean edge over here. From here, you'll begin turning it inside out. Once inside out, I'm not getting a very clean corner here. So I'm going to take my favorite little corner turner and just see if we can poke it through a little bit more and get a nice good edge on it. Now that it's right side out, I'll take it over to the iron and press it flat. We've pressed our ties. We are now going to line them up with the seam side facing down. We're going to line up our notches along the edge here and pin in place, and then we'll sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. We can now move on to the facings. We've got one back neck facing and then two front neck facings. We're going to begin by attaching these front neck facings to the back neck at the shoulder seam, and you'll match up your notches along here to make sure that it's aligned properly. Oh, I did forget to mention, you should have previously interfaced the both facing front and back. Your interfacing should match whatever weight of fabric you are using. So I'm using a very, very lightweight fabric, and so I have gone with a sheer weight interfacing. If you are using a heavier weight fabric, you'll want to negotiate that with your interfacing. So you'll sew it together at the shoulder seams, 5/8 inch seam allowance, similar to the rest of the garment. And when it's constructed, it will cross over in the front because your dress crosses over in the front. So if it does look like that, you're on the right path. Our shoulder seams on our facing has been sewn. And now we're going to, on the outer edge, turn it under and top stitch it. Just like the front of the skirt, I have created a long running stitch, 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and I've ironed all along that line. So from here, I'm going to just fold it over again, pin it in place, and then we will top stitch it from here. And you get a nice clean finish edge. Once I'm done with the top stitching, I'll take it over to my iron and press it as well. Our facing has been attached. Before we actually move on, we are going to need to do some clipping. We've got a lot of bulk right here in the corner, so I'm going to clip this and trim it down even. And then I'm going to clip all along the curvature of the front and just a couple of clips right at the back neck to ease this curvature as well. Once I'm done clipping, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the facing, and then I'm going to top stitch along the seam allowance, probably about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, to hold that seam allowance in place and make sure that the facing doesn't keep peeking out. And when you're clipping, clip to the stitching line, not through it. The facing has been attached. When I attached the facing, I turned up this little extra seam allowance at the very bottom, right where your waistband joins your skirt. So we're going to actually take that and fold it all along, and we're going to match that up with the seam that's running along your waistband joining, and we'll pin it in place.
I've also gone along the rest of the facing and I've smoothed it out so it's 1-to-1 and pinned that in place as well. Now, to secure this, you could do it one of two ways. You could stitch in the ditch on the outside here with a straight stitch, and you could stitch all along here at the front if you would like. And then your stitching would show, which would give you a certain accent, or you could do a blind stitch, and that's what I'm going to do. That does require some hand sewing, so I will just take my needle and thread, and I'll just sew along my invisible stitch. As I move off the seam allowance and onto the fabric that could potentially show through to the other side, I'm going to be sure that I'm only catching 1 or 2 of the fabric threads. And they'll just look like a little pinprick on the other side. I'm going to continue that all the way around until I reach the other side, the other waist. It's the next day. I have let my dress hang overnight. The bottom portion of the skirt is cut on the bias. And so when it's cut on the bias, it can hang unevenly, and you want to give it about at least overnight to hang. Some people like to do 24 hours. I think I'll be fine with these 12. And it has warped just a little bit, not a huge amount, but I can see a little misshape here. And here at the back, I can really see it. Here's my center back seam, which has held it pretty stable. And it's scooped down quite a bit here and quite a bit on the other side. So I need to even that out before we hem it. I'm just going to take my ruler. There are special tools you can use as well, but I just use my ruler. And I'm going to mark it along where I want to cut. From here, I'll just cut off the excess where I've pinned, and then I can hem it at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Hem has been turned over twice and top stitched in place. It's a 1/4 inch hem, so you turn it over 1/4 inch once and 1/4 inch twice, and then you take it to your machine using a straight stitch. You just stitch it in place. Now that the hem has been completed, your garment is done and ready to wear.